Bain, and Alan Batkin Professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Rochester. Among several books Dr. Rubel has written, Doubting the Devout, the Ultra-Orthodox in the Jewish American Imagination was published in 2009. How fortuitous that years later, the Netflix series Shtisel, featuring the Haredi, ultra-Orthodox community in Jerusalem, feeds directly into Dr. Rubel's unique qualifications to share her perspectives with us. In June of 2019, she was quoted in journalist Peter Beinart's article in The Atlantic, unpacking the immense popularity of Shtisel. Quote, still, it's telling that so many American Jews are eager to find universality in a form of particularity that in the past they found deeply unpleasant. In her 2009 book, Doubting the Devout, the Ultra-Orthodox in the Jewish American Imagination, the University of Rochester's Nora Rubel notes that the Haredim have often been, quote, a source of anxiety and embarrassment for modern Jews, end quote. Dr. Rubel will help us unpack and explore the Shtisel series' overwhelming popularity this evening. And as Susan just mentioned, in terms of any housekeeping issues, if you do have questions during Nora's talks, please feel free to post them on chat, and we will do our best to address them either in real time or when Dr. Rubel is through with her presentation. And so now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our own Dr. Nora Rubel.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. This is a pretty big crowd for Zoom. I want to thank, I'm actually going to share my screen now, and we will move on with that. Okay. I want to thank Marcia and Susan for inviting me. Like many of you, probably, I miss being in the Sinai building. But I'm glad that we can still gather in different ways. I'll admit that this is the first time that I've done a talk like this on Zoom. I've been teaching on Zoom. I've given conference presentations on Zoom, but in talks like this, I normally like to get a bit of participation. So I may stop a few times to either answer questions or ask them. And of course, there's going to be a Q&A after the talk. So please do put any questions you might have in the chat box. And as mentioned in that very gracious introduction, I published a book about a decade ago called Doubting the Devout that has apparently finally become relevant. So that's nice. The book explored an increasing polarization and hostility among American Jews over differing views on religious observance, political affiliation, and the reconciliation of Judaism with the general culture. I considered negative representations of the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, in Jewish literature and film, as they reflected liberal Jews' concerns over Orthodox Judaism's growing shift to the right. My main argument was that at the heart of this conflict is an argument for the soul of American Jewry, one that demonstrates anxiety over the construction of gender roles, the related issues of gender and religious authority, and the uncompromising nature of the Haredim, seen by non-Haredi Jews as threatening to Jewish claims of Americanness. In the book, I bring up the age-old question of who is a Jew and juxtapose it with the question, who is an American? By analyzing the way Orthodoxy has been represented by American Jews on both page and screen, I looked at the core factors in this contemporary culture war and highlighted what I saw as a deeply rooted concern over acculturation, Americanization, and Jewish continuity. So it's not really just a story about Jews and their self-consciousness, but it is more broadly a study of religious assimilation and anxiety about the ways we become more or less the memories of our ancestors. What that means for tonight's talk is that I have spent a lot of time reading novels and watching movies that specifically feature Haredim. I included some television, the odd Law and Order episode, in order to make a few points, but on the whole, the period I was highlighting between 1985 and 2005 didn't have a ton of Haredi TV. Things have obviously changed a lot since then. And one thing that has changed is the number and quality of memoirs written by former Haredim, allowing for a diversity of stories, more types of stories and more nuance. Another thing that has changed is Netflix, which has been able to provide an incredible amount of content, which is how we come to Shtisel. I'm sorry, I think this is right. Nope, okay. Premiering in 2013 on an Israeli channel, it finally reached Netflix in 2018. And then suddenly it was like all anyone was talking about, at least on my social media. My husband and I often talk about how we have different internets, and mine is clearly full of a bunch of Jewish academics who watch a lot of television. And I kept being asked, how have you not watched Shtisel yet? It's so obvious that you would watch Shtisel. It was in my queue, but I felt like I needed real time to sit down and watch something with subtitles. My limited Hebrew, apologies to my Israeli mother, is not enough. And, you know, I'm working on other things. The book came out a while ago, so I didn't feel an urgency. But last spring, Peter Beinart from The Atlantic emailed me and said that he was reading my book and would like to talk to me about a piece he was writing about Shtisel. And I said, of course, I'd love to talk to you about Shtisel. I'm really busy for the next couple of days, but if I could catch up with you later in the week, that would be great. And so I sat down on my couch, figuring I would watch a few episodes, and I was absolutely hooked from the beginning. I just spent the next few days binging it, having the excuse of work. And at one time, my daughter Ruby, who was homesick with strep throat at the time, wandered in and said, "Is this a soap opera?" And I thought about it for a moment. And then I said, yes, it is a soap opera. So I want to unmute everybody for a second. I'm going to stop sharing. And I just want to know, well, how many of you have watched soap operas in your life or watch a soap opera? Hands up. Yeah. So this is, I mean, this is kind of what a soap opera is, right? This is, for those of you that have seen it. I know that not everybody has seen it, but it gives you an idea of what kind of show we're talking about. So it's a show that deals with a regular set of characters, often a central family or families, and sentimentally follows their loves and their losses, their work lives, their friendships. And I think it's not an accident. And I just watched the first episode and the last episode again, just so that I could have it fresh in my mind. It's not an accident that in the first episode, the grandmother, Malka, so beautifully played by the late actress Hannah Reber, is watching American soap operas in her room at the assisted living facility that she's just moved into. She tells her son Shulam, who is horrified that she's watching television at all, right? Like she has been sort of, the Rebbitzin down the hall has a box like this, and so I'm going to have one. She says, I think she's watching The Young and the Restless. This is not my story, so I'm not 100% sure, but some of you may know. But she's watching an American soap, and she says, see, these are the real Americans. They have 5 children. It's beautiful. I think she says something like, not like the atheist pigs with, you know, 1 child and a dog, right? And so I wonder, because we love Shtisel and we watch Shtisel, do we, as American Jews, now think we know the real Haredim? And if so, how do we feel about them? In Woody Allen's film, Annie Hall, 1977, Diane Keaton, the quintessential wasp, I'm so sorry, the quintessential wasp, tells Woody Allen, the classic neurotic Jew, that he is what her Grammy would call a real Jew. And later in the film, Allen attends an Easter dinner at Keaton's family home. While passing around the dynamite ham, he imagines the family sees him as an ultra-Orthodox Jew, sporting a black hat, black coat, payas, and a long beard. Regardless of what Granny Hall may or may not have meant by a real Jew, and I'm pretty sure that she didn't mean Hasidic Jew. I think she meant it in the anti-Semitic, like money pinching, anxious New York Jew manner. This is what Allen sees as a parody of the real Jew. The Jew is seen from the outside, the Jew he doesn't want to be. And for him and many non-Orthodox Jews, authentic Judaism is often associated with the world of the ultra-Orthodox. This association has led to a problematic and contentious relationship among contemporary American Jews over the nature of Jewish identity, one that can be observed through popular imaginings of Haredim in contemporary culture, and as will be seen in our case study of Shtisel. Perhaps we should begin, before a discussion of who are the Shtisels, with a discussion of terms. Who are the Haredim? These are Jews who are often referred to as ultra-Orthodox, although they themselves do not like the term. The preferred term scholars use is an Israeli one, Haredim. Those who tremble comes from Isaiah, those who tremble before the word of God. They are a minority within a minority. Jews make up less than 2% of all Americans. About 10% of American Jews are Orthodox, and of that 10%, about a third are Haredi. So you can imagine how tiny a group this is in the United States broadly. Yet despite the small numbers, the Haredim are remarkably diverse. Ultra-Orthodoxy, if we're going to use that term, which I don't love, but sometimes it works. It's a broad umbrella-like term that includes both Hasidic and non-Hasidic groups. It's obvious that non-Hasidic is also not a satisfying word, right? Like it's like they're not Hasidic, but what are they? So occasionally the non-Hasidic groups go by a variety of other terms. So sometimes they use the term yeshivish because they're usually associated with a yeshiva, a certain community. Sometimes they're referred to as Lithuanian style because the history is a lot of yeshivas in Lithuania. Often in the literature, they're referred to as mitnagdim or misnagdim, which is also a frustrating term, but because it means opponents. So it's obviously a term that Hasidim use about this other group, right? So it's nobody says, "Oh, I'm an opponent," unless they're really excited to be like, "Yes, you know, I'm the opponent." So, but the term is used a lot to describe the non-Hasidic Haredim. But to outsiders, right? Unless you are actually Haredi, these people are often just seen as a monolithic group of religious Jews. Generally speaking, they can be identified on the street by the men's black coats and hats and the women's modest dress and head coverings. Despite being almost indistinguishable to outsiders, however, this community harbors a great diversity. Hasidism, which is often seen as the oldest, most traditional form of Judaism, is actually a relatively new countercultural movement founded in the mid-18th century in the Ukraine by Israel ben Eliezer, also known as the Baal Shem Tov. Hasidism was a movement of religious renewal. Hasidism emphasized mysticism and claimed that simple faith, inward passion, and fervent prayer are as important as Talmudic scholarship. By emphasizing the holiness in everyday life, the Baal Shem Tov developed a large and enthusiastic following. His disciples subsequently dispersed to many areas of Eastern Europe, bringing their new devotional religiosity with them and establishing a variety of communities of Hasidim, separate and independent from local rabbinic authority, which means separate from these yeshivas. And they were actually seen as heretical at one point, given the importance that was placed on yeshiva scholarship in contemporaneous Jewish communities. So what essentially separates Hasidim and non-Hasidic Jews in structure is the centrality of a rebbe in Hasidic communities. And this is a dynastic position that means much more than a rabbi. It's almost like a kingdom, essentially. Traditionally, non-Hasidic communities are linked to a yeshiva, but differences between Hasidim and Mitnagdim are far less pronounced today. Hasidic Jews now also put a great emphasis on putting their children providing their children with a thorough Jewish education, including yeshiva studies. Hasidic groups in America that did not build yeshivot after World War II really didn't do very well without the power of youth, sometimes called the Rebbe's soldiers. Those that already had yeshivot were the Lubavitchers, the Bobov, Randomsk, and Slonim, and those were exceptions among the Hasidim. But after World War II, you had immigration and a bunch of other yeshivas and groups started. And while non-Hasidic Jews lack a rebbe as the center of their community, they too revere certain rabbis as great scholars. So the increased authority of the Rosh Yeshiva, head of the yeshiva, is indicative of this fusion of roles. Attire is another area where the differences between the Hasidim and the yeshivish have become less evident, as some yeshivish have adopted Hasidic dress patterns. While outsiders see only the telltale black coats and long skirts, Orthodox feminist Blue Greenberg has remarked, perhaps in no other area is there so much diversity among Orthodox Jews. The Haredim can distinguish among members of their many factions by minor visual differences in those ubiquitous black coats, especially in the manner of dress for Shabbat and festivals. For example, some Haredi men wear short pants with white stockings, and some wear long pants. Some Haredi black hats are trimmed with fur, others are not. And while religious women cannot be as easily distinguished by affiliation with specific Haredi sects in the way men can, their mode of dress signals identity with the religious community at large. All Haredi women follow similar guidelines: sleeves that cover elbows, high necklines, and long skirts with stockings. Pants are considered immodest always. While different movements disagree over the issues of the color and the opacity of stockings or whether to wear wigs or headscarves, religious women's clothing expresses the value of tznius, modesty, held sacred in the Haredi community. The Hasidim and Mitnagdim also evince far less animosity toward each other now that they have a mutual objective, which is maintaining Orthodox Judaism as practiced in pre-World War II Eastern Europe. This goal is threatened by contemporary Judaism as practiced by the majority of North American Jews. That's most of us, which the Haredim see as diluted, compromising, and potentially leading to the gradual abandonment of Jewish identity altogether. Such concerns led one European rabbi to warn in 1956, "We face three dangers to the development of a pure and enduring orthodoxy: Reform Judaism, conservative Judaism, and the modern Orthodox." So even modern Orthodoxy was seen as especially dangerous because it held the mantle of authority. Given their shrinking differences and mutual concerns for the future, it's easy to see how the Hasidim and Mitnagdim, who make up a very small percentage of American Jews, are easily lumped in together. In Israel, however, the numbers are far greater. The Haredim make up about 12% of Israelis, so still a minority, but a sizable minority. While many terms are used to describe them, the Haredim refer to themselves in Yiddish as Yidden, Jews, or Ehrlicher Yidden, true Jews. Not ultra-Orthodox, not Haredi, just simply Jews. sociologist Samuel Heilman writes, this insider name implies their conviction that, contrary to what others may suggest, they are not a separate sect called Haredim, nor a subgroup in a new homeland for Hebrews, but very simply the true Jews. This identification implies their understanding of themselves as authentic, traditional Jews with no change over time. It is this self-understanding that other Jews understandably find rather irritating. Zionism, at one point, was also seen as antithetical to Haredi sensibilities. The idea of creating a secular Jewish state in the Holy Land of Palestine was considered sacrilegious to those who believed that Zion should be reestablished only by the Messiah, who would rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Additionally, most Jews involved with the early Zionist movement were far from observant Jews in the eyes of the Haredim. After 1967, however, some Hasidic groups, most notably the Lubavitchers or Chabad, have changed their tune and support Israel as a means of ushering in the Messianic age. Others continue to be more conflicted about Israel. On the far other end of the Haredi spectrum remain groups such as the Satmars, who have an offshoot called Neturei Karta, a group that's often seen protesting Israel alongside Palestinians. These are the guys that photographers love to get pictures of because they're, Hasidic Jews, and they're at pro-Palestinian rallies. Because of this diversity, there's also a category of religious Zionists known in Israel as Haredim Leumim, but previously referred to as Datim Leumim. Religious Zionism influences many of the West Bank and Gaza settlements and therefore receives a lot of press in the United States. So currently, many non-Haredi Jews harbor both a fascination with and an aversion to the Haredi lifestyle. This fascination reveals itself in a variety of attitudes towards the ultra-Orthodox. The appeal of an authentic, whatever that means, really, old world brand of Judaism, the kind one's grandparents may have practiced, stems from a nostalgia for a world never encountered. Synagogue-sponsored sightseeing trips to the Lower East Side, I went on one of those when I was in high school, designed to see remnants of authentic Jewish life before returning to the suburbs, also foster a certain wistfulness for what seems in retrospect to be simpler times. While historians emphasize the poverty and anti-Semitism experienced by these archaic, pious Jews, many in the Jewish community celebrate the musical memories of Fiddler on the Roof or storybook shtetl images created by Sholem Aleichem, Isaac Bashevis Singer, and Marc Chagall. In an age of suburban sprawl and social alienation, the perceived warmth of such tightly knit communities is often very enticing. For a contemporary generation, more likely to have grown up with a doctor than a dairy farmer in the house, quaint images of women in traditional head coverings and men in black coats with long beards stir up nostalgia for attic-stored, sepia-tinted pictures of a long-lost heritage that, for most Jews, had been destroyed in the Holocaust. Svetlana Baim's The Future of Nostalgia explains, nostalgia from nostos, return home, and algia, longing, is a longing for a home that no longer exists or never existed. Nostalgia is a sentiment of loss and displacement, but it is also a romance with one's own fantasy. Baim also points out that this romance can only be played out from a distance, either through time or space. When one gets too close, the illusion shatters and the nostalgia is gone. Thus, enjoyment of Fiddler on the Roof does not include detailed reminders of pogroms. Rather, the emphasis is on singing, cooking, a large, loving family, and a strong sense of continuity and tradition. Such are the yesteryear memories worth preserving. Contemporary American Jewish nostalgias manifest themselves in several ways. First, nostalgia may emerge as a spectator pleasure, the sort that Daphne Merkin observes in Revolving Door Jews, staunch secularists who disdain visible signs of affiliation, suddenly lining up to take a closer look at the quaint religious customs long ago left in the care of tottering relatives in Miami Beach. Nostalgia may also manifest through spiritual reflection, goading the individual to renew singular aspects of the tradition. However, the most extreme embodiment of contemporary Jewish nostalgia is the restoration impulse. Here, the Jew longs to return to the shtetl, to return him or herself to that sepia-tinted moment. This brand of nostalgia, according to Boehm, is at the core of recent national and religious revivals. Within such nostalgia, she continues, two plots prevail: the dreamy return to origins and the fear of an antagonistic conspiracy. With a desire for the old and a fear of the new, this restorative nostalgia is the attempted recreation of Eastern European shtetls in urban Brooklyn or Baltimore. And these are some photos from South Williamsburg in Brooklyn. Ironically, the same elements that attract American Jews also serve to feed the aversion that many feel toward the Haredim. As Boehm further points out, alja, the longing, is what we share, yet nostos, the return home, is what divides us. The warmth of the tightly knit community, for example, is predicated upon separatism and the exclusion of others. With the exception of a few Hasidic groups that proselytize to less observant Jews, specifically Chabad, these communities are closed to outsiders, especially those who happen to be Jewish. The Haredim have no problem proudly claiming their chosenness, a concept with which contemporary Jews living in a pluralistic society struggle, and in some cases even outright reject. This perceived arrogance, coupled with its lack of tolerance, sits awkwardly with many American Jews who overwhelmingly view religious tolerance as a virtue. Liz Harris's ethnography from 1985, Holy Days, The World of a Hasidic Family, demonstrates this dualistic fascination with and aversion to the Haredim. Believing that the Hasidim represented some antique version of myself, I have always felt vaguely bound to them and curious to know who they were, a curiosity that neither my education, my social milieu, nor my reading of Hasidic stories did much to satisfy. She also refers to the strong reactions her Jewish friends had to her study of the Hasidim, responding either with remarks that demonstrated wistful nostalgia or with angry, disdainful outbursts, summing up the twofold relationship of non-Haredi Jews to the Hasidim or the ultra-Orthodox. Harris herself displays both these sentiments in her study of a Lubavitcher Hasidic family in Crown Heights, and she likely would agree that the romanticized old-time Jews of the shtetl are not likely to be found in Borough Park or Crown Heights today. Another idealized element of the Haredi world is its family life, and I promise we're getting to Shtisel soon. The family life is characterized by clearly defined roles for husbands and wives, fathers and mothers, sons and daughters. Others point out that these clearly defined gender roles that are attractive to some are dependent on a rigidly patriarchal system that allows for little deviance from societal norms. The construction of gender roles and the related issue of gender and religious authority are among the most important issues impacting relations between Haredi and non-Haredi Jews. The dramatic changes in the religious roles of Jewish women have recently forced American Jews to choose sides. Not that recently, but the majority of American Jews prize gender equality and demonstrate their perspective by approving the ordination of rabbis, of women as rabbis. For those members of liberal Jewish movements, there's little tolerance for Judaism that does not support a woman's right to publicly read from the Torah. Beyond public religious life, the emphasized domestic nature of the Haredi woman as wife and mother seems to contradict both contemporary American and Jewish ideals. The Haredim break with mainstream American egalitarian values over this position of women, and it is this issue that comes up frequently when Haredim are criticized by non-Haredi Jews. And so, a dichotomy exists in the Jewish American imagination when it comes to the ultra-Orthodox. On one hand, there's been a respect for those who are defenders of the faith, those who, despite all obstacles and influences, insist on keeping the flame of observant Judaism alive. But on the other hand, there exists an anger toward those who, while claiming to be the only true Jews, espouse attitudes that the majority of American Jews reject. So while liberal Jews may like the idea of the Haredim, they might not actually like the Haredim. The conjured image is perceived as incongruous with reality, and the attempt to embrace the authenticity of the past sits uncomfortably with the present. Paradoxically, the supposed authenticity of the Haredim is the very thing that threatens many American Jews. If one accepts the claim that the ultra-Orthodox are the real Jews, what does that say about the legitimacy of all other American Jews? Obviously, we are currently holding this discussion in an American, woman-led Reform congregation. My earlier book primarily focused on narratives written and directed by American and some Israeli Jews that purport to describe the inner world of ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities. These images were not always, and for the most part, were not flattering. The books and films I analyzed were laden with suspicion rather than sentiment, nerves rather than nostalgia. The most recent Frum hit, Unorthodox, is far more in keeping. This is also on Netflix, for those of you who have not watched that yet. It's far more in keeping with those works than Shtisel is. Such narratives appeal to non-Orthodox Jews because they confirm our misgivings about the Haredim. We don't oppress women or gay people. We are open-minded about education and science. We believe there is value in engaging with the outside world. By the way, we're not always great at these things either, like just to, in parentheses, but nonetheless, we believe it about ourselves and it makes us feel good. But Shtisel does not just appeal to us as liberal American Jews. Secular Israelis who have their own complicated relationships with the Haredim love it. Yiddishisms from the show have crept into daily Hebrew. Haredim themselves are secretly watching it. And I say secretly in that they all talk about it and write about it online. And they're probably watching it on phones and illegally downloading it because most of them don't actually have TVs or the internet in their house, but they're watching it. The theme song is regularly played at Haredi weddings. There's a story that there is some nigun song that they made up for the show that it aired on television, and 2 days later, a Haredi band played it at a wedding and sent a video of it through WhatsApp to the creators. Like, they couldn't believe it. They're like, we made it up. It's not a traditional nigun. Like, it's a thing we made up, and they're playing it. So what makes Shtisel different from these stories? It lacks the feeling of oppressive authority forcing main characters into a life they don't want. Religious observance is the setting, it's not the plot. I have found myself explaining that the show is more like a period piece in the way we enjoy it. It's like Downton Abbey in that way. Once you understand that there are weird rules about property inheritance that govern many of the choices people make, we can just sit back and swoon at the pretty people who fall in and out of love with each other. It's not about wanting to leave your life. It's about living your life within the boundaries of that community. So we're going to talk about the show. I am assuming, well, now I know because we've had a poll, that many of you have watched it. I'm wondering if I can bring up the poll. Can it, Marcia or Susan, can you unmute yourself and tell me the results of the poll?
I can unmute myself. I cannot access the poll.
Okay, then, oh, because I'm sharing. Hold on. The poll, okay. All right, so a lot of you have watched it. 32 out of 40 of you have watched it. 22 out of 40 of you have finished it. It's pretty good. All right, good. I'm glad we have this technology. All right, I'm going back to my screen. Okay, so I'm not going to do any major spoiling, is what essentially this is. I'm going to talk a little bit about the show. I'm going to open it up to conversation because I think those of you that have watched it probably want to talk about it. So, oh no, okay, that was in the wrong place. Okay, so the Shtisels, who are they? They are a family that live in Geula, which is not Mia Sharim. This is significant because for anybody that knows about Haredim in Israel, they probably know about Mea Sharim as a very, very strict Haredi community. It's a lot of times people want to tour it because it's so religious, but there's also always these stories about, you know, the signs that are up about how one needs to dress to be appropriate in there. So the fact that the Shtisels live in Gula is significant because they give us a sense of the sort of Haredim they are. In fact, a couple of times non-Haredim can say that one of the characters is from Mea Sharim, and he needs to actually, you know, correct them. We know that they are not Hasidic, but we know that they are also more of a relaxed brand of yeshivish. So what I've read suggests that they're modeled after sort of a very old Haredi family that has been in Jerusalem probably since the 19th century, and is kind of takes things easy for the most part, religious, but things are funny to them, you know. They have more relaxed pace. They're not very tight pace, which I guess is a metaphor. Gula is also, just for trivia to bring up to your Shtisel loving friends, I found out today that Gula is the site of the first Haredi bar in Israel. They don't actually call it a bar, but it is a bar where people go and have drinks, and married couples go, and single people come after yeshiva, and they drink beer and other alcoholic beverages and listen to music. So that's something to tell you what Geula is like. The name of the show, actually, Shtisel, comes from a restaurant in Geula that the head writers, Honatan Indursky and Uri Elan, met at while thinking about writing some things together. They said the name of the restaurant is Shtisel, and they're like, we don't know what we're going to write, but we're going to call it Shtisel. Like somehow we're going to make it be called Shtisel, which is great. So both of the writers have religious roots, and so much of the acclaim the show has received has to do with the accuracy of small things. So an example would be, a similar example would be like acclaim for Mad Men, right? Which is, again, also a period piece that many of us enjoyed without wanting to adopt the gender norms of the time or the period, but they got all the small things right. I think at some point my mother said that she had the same bedspread that she saw in an episode of Mad Men. I could be making that up. She's here. She can refute that during the Q&A. But people are very excited when they see things that, you know, are time period accurate. So Shtisel, so let's talk about these characters. Okay, so we've got, this is the patriarch. These are the main characters. Shulam Shtisel, who is hilarious. He is the father of 3 children, Akiva, Gitti, and Spi Aryeh. They all have their own like issues going on. So this is this is without spoiling, just giving you an information about who these people are. So Akiva is kind of the screw up of the family. He lives with Shulam. The two of them, this is the main focus of the drama. And Akiva is 26, I think. He's older and he has yet to get married, hence living with his father. He's also an aspiring artist, which is kind of a classic story of someone trapped in a, not trapped, but in a community that doesn't necessarily prize that, but he aspires to do it anyway. It's seen as something funny that he does. It's not seen as something like terrible that he does. but it's not seen as like a good plan. And that kind of comes along with all of his botched matchmaking. So you just sort of see a bunch of these kind of failed dates and failed experiences. And then there's some that go a little further and that you get very invested in. And so there's played by some fantastic Israeli actors. The one daughter is Gitti Weiss, and she's married to Lipa Weiss, who I have to admit, I've not watched Srugim yet, but he is apparently the heartthrob on Srugim. And it's once you get into the show and you see past the hats and the beards, like you kind of get it, right? So both Lipa Weiss and both the actors who play Lipa Weiss and Akiva are like Israeli heartthrobs. They're very, very handsome men. Spi Arya is the other son. He is kind of a goofy character also. He seems very serious. We don't see much about his wife. I actually realized I neglected to put a picture of her up here, but the only thing we know about her is she's trying to get him to trap a rat or mice like constantly, and it's always taking him away from his studies. But he's a very serious scholar who also used to love to sing, and so that's also part of his thing. And then we have Gitti Weiss, who is married to Lipa, and they have a difficult marriage. They have a bunch of children, and he travels for work a lot, and it is difficult for them. And these are like family dramas, right? This doesn't sound like anything that is specifically religious in nature, but the setting again is religious. And here's a picture, and just because I liked this picture, I used this picture. This is in no way, shape, or these are different women. They deserve their own pictures. I realized after the fact that I didn't put their own pictures up, but I do like this picture of them together. Ruchami Weiss, who is her daughter, Gitti's daughter, is really she's played by Shira Haas, who is the star of the new show Unorthodox, and she's really a wonderful actor, and she's beautiful in this and has a really lovely part as well. Nuchem Shtisel only shows up in the second season, primarily to play like a very goofy villain. He's Shulam's son, and they come when their mother is in the hospital. That's all I'll say about that. But Malka Shtisel is the lovely matriarch of the family who's living in the assisted living facility, who has become addicted to soap operas. She also at one point has this like funny relationship with like a Mizrahi resident who she only speaks Yiddish, he only speaks Arabic, and yet somehow they both have dementia, and like it's beautiful. It's a beautiful story. So yeah. So I would say, I'm realizing the time has gone really fast. I'm sorry about that. That I've been going on. I think Shtisel is good for the reasons that TV shows are good. There's good writing, there's good acting, there's good plot. It's not merely appealing because it is in Hebrew, because it is Israeli, or because it's about Jews. And I actually ultimately think that much of what makes the show successful with such a broad group of people is what it's not about. So it's set in Israel, but it's not about Israel. Nuchem is this kind of character that brings to the fore something that is unstated. The whole show avoids dealing with the question of the occupation, which just shows that like not everything has to be about everything. But one would think from watching Shtisel, there are no Palestinians in Israel. But one might also think that there are no, or at least there are very few Chilonim, non-religious Jews in Israel. So the Shtisel, the Shtisels are not Zionists. They are actually anti-Zionists. And we only see this play out really one time. And there's an episode on Israeli Independence Day where there's an air show, and there are a lot of the kids want to watch the air show, and they feel at the Jewish school at the Cheder, they feel this need to tell people not to watch the air show because it's essentially like the nonsense of the Zionists. But people like to watch the planes. So it is this kind of but this is as political as it gets, really. And then you also get Nuchem, who lives in Antwerp, and he comes in, and his whole thing is that his expression is like wicked people, these horrible bastards, you know, and he's talking about the Zionists, right? Like they're just these awful people, anyone that's not his people. But this wicked people thing has become just a favorite expression. So other things that I wanted to just bring up quickly before we're done is that we have, there's a lot of Yiddish in the show. This was something that they were concerned about at the beginning. They were using subtitles, but they were worried that too much Yiddish would turn people off. But there's more Yiddish in the second season between Shulam and Nuchem. The older you are, the more Yiddish you speak. It seems that the younger people know both Yiddish and Hebrew. And that just shows kind of the more that the Haredim in Israel, who, you know, some communities really only speak Yiddish, more and more are engaging with modern Hebrew because they're becoming more assimilated to the country. And then I do think that probably the thing that is the hook for everybody is the question of the family. And so I wanted to kind of end on some images here and open it up to discussion. There is, and I think that, I don't know if it was Marcia that said it at the beginning, that there is a season 3 trailer that you can Google and you can see if you need like your fix of Shtisel. And it's, yeah, so I feel like Baruch Hashem in 2021, maybe all things will be better and we will also have Shtisel. And if things are not better, we will also still have Shtisel. And that would be great. So I want to thank you for having me and letting me talk a little bit about some stuff that I've done. Oh, it's The Bold and the Beautiful, Joshua Faber says. I see, I didn't know. It's called The Bold and the Beautiful, and he says they're not really not so bold or so beautiful. So that's the show that the Bubby is watching in the show. But yeah, so thank you for having me. Oh, she said that they were not so bold or so beautiful. Thank you.
Season 2.
Sorry? Someone say something?
Chaim Potok.
I have a
Yeah,
question
okay.
for you.
Yes.
Did you say that the Haredim were 12% of the Israelis, or were you saying that the Orthodox, the Hasidim, were 12%?
Just speak
So
up.
Hasidim are a subset of Haredim.
Yes.
So there's modern Orthodox or religious in Israel. It's kind of more complicated, but as far as Haredim, which includes both the non-Hasidic and Hasidic ultra Orthodox, that's 12% of the Israeli population.
Okay, that's what I misspoke. Okay.
Yeah.
I love the mother though.
So great, right? I love her.
Oh, she was fantastic.
She was fantastic.
She
She
was-
sadly died, and
Mhm.
so they had to replace her in the second season, but she was wonderful. The Frischmans have their hand up. Is that right? Are people allowed to unmute themselves, Susan?
Yes, we could.
Oh, okay.
Okay, can you hear me now? No.
Yes. Yes.
We're familiar with Chaim Potok's, My Name is Asher Lev, and we
Mhm.
were struck by how this is in many ways stolen from that. It's similar in the sense it's an Orthodox family and he's an artist, and you know, it just seems like it was sort of part of it, at least, was taken from that novel.
Season 2 in particular. I don't want to give any spoilers away, but
Right.
season 2 really is very similar.
Right. You have this kind of the draw of the outside world, right? Recognition from outside of your community. I would say that's a similar storyline, but that's also a storyline you see in other places as well, right? Like the draw of art. And Chaim Potok himself speaks of that, right? That somehow it's difficult to be an artist in this community. And that's why there are so many former Orthodox Jews who've become writers, because that was an outlet that was a little more respectable in a way. And so this kind of the idea of being a figuristic portrait artist is problematic, right, in the Orthodox community.
Any more questions or feedback, thoughts?
I have a question.
Yeah.
There were times that I felt that it
Flying.
put a very poor light on orthodoxy. Some dishonesty, cheating, this and that. Did anybody else feel the same way?
In the show, in Shtisel?
Yeah.
I think
I
that's
just
opened
felt
up to
for
the group.
somebody that saw it for the very first time and not understanding or having much background with Orthodox Jews, it put them in a very bad light. It's almost like you hear, you go down the 42nd Street to the Diamond District, but you got to watch out because the Jews are, these Orthodox Jews, they're there to cheat you, quote unquote.
I actually thought just the reverse of that myself. I mean, I don't know, are people hearing me? I don't know if I'm on.
Yeah.
Yes.
We got you.
I thought actually just the reverse of that. I mean, I'm not somebody who knows much about Orthodox Judaism or these particular versions of Orthodox Judaism. I'm not Jewish myself, although everybody I know seems to be Jewish.
You look at
Moving in that direction. But the thing that was striking to me was how likably human most of these characters were, and how what was interesting, I thought, as a really the continuing theme in the show really is how difficult they find it. Almost all the major characters at one point or another find it difficult to live by the rules and customs of their own community, of their own version of Judaism. And they're always bumping up against this. And somebody's at one point is trying to be the enforcer of the sort of the rules against, like the father against the son, trying to pull him back and make him live more by the rules of the community. And yet he himself, Shulam, has some difficulties in continuing to live, absolutely, fixedly by those rules and customs. And so I think the part of the negative image that people have of Orthodox Judaism, or at least this version of Orthodox Judaism, and maybe more so even among non-Jews than among Jews, is this idea that they're all fanatical, that they all are just absolutely rigidly adherent, to their own rules and customs and vision of the world, and don't have any room for any kind of flexibility within their community. And it really shows a different picture of that. And so to me, it was, it presented to me what I thought was a more, in a way, kind of hopeful version of that community.
They struggled.
Yeah, because they struggle with their own orthodoxy.
They're human.
They're
Can I ask-
human.
Can I ask a
There's
question? Sorry.
Oh, sure. No, I was just going to respond that, yeah, I think that the point that the writers wanted to show with this community is that they're just, it's an interesting show about people that happen to be Haredi, right? And so you're going to have some like no goodniks, right? And then you're going to have like the people that are really good and tragic. And then you're going to have, you're just going to have well-rounded people. But no, I mean, I think that if you wanted negative portrayals of the Haredim, there's a lot worse out there. I like a lot worse out there. I think this is seen as a very refreshing, lovely, like everybody's attractive, I mean, they're funny, they're, you learn to love them, even if you might feel like they're a little odd at first. And anyway, Diane, I'm sorry. You were
Yeah,
gonna say
sorry,
something.
just a quick question, because I know we're almost done. In the second season, which I won't give away, there is a subplot where there's a young person a very young person who ends up getting married. And I'm just wondering, how realistic is that particular thing? Like, I think she's maybe 14 or 15. I don't know if I'm.
16,
I think she was actually 16.
16.
15.
Yeah, so she
16.
seems very young. So how realistic is it? It depends on the community. That is a little young. And I think you even see that her parents think that she's a little young, right? They are resistant to it. So I would say that that's a situation where you have kind of a realistic representation of what many people would see as kind of slightly young for getting
But
married.
not
I mean,
unusual.
what?
But it's not unusual either.
It's not incredibly unusual. It's also not incredibly unusual here. You know, it depends on the community you're living in, right? But yes, I mean that's certainly seen as an unusual thing, and we don't know how that totally turns out either yet. Josh, you had your hand up. Joshua?
Yeah, so one thing that struck me with the show, and I think there's some definite parallels to American society too. The role of empathy is just really strongly gendered in the entire show. The women's lives are built around empathy and sympathy, you know, for each other, for the men. With most of the male characters in the show, you know, they live in this very rigid set of rules that doesn't seem to allow for that, and that's why Akiva kind of stands out. Akiva is, you know, the very sensitive soul in a family and seemingly a world that doesn't, you know, have a lot of place for that, you know, for him.
Yeah.
So is that, I'm not quite sure what the question is here, but I guess, is that kind of just the soap opera aspect of the show, or is that kind of one of the big tensions in, you know, the Haredi life, you know, that the rigidity of the rules, you know, the emotional consequences of that kind of thing?
You know, I mean, there are scholars who say that there's like, you know, when we look at the Haredim, there actually gender roles are very different. The types of masculinity and the types of femininity that are seen as ideal types are different in those communities, and some of that has to do with these kind of separate spheres for men and women, right? That there's an ability to be more it's a different form of masculinity than what we kind of prize as manliness, right? Like there's a different type of manliness. I don't know if that would answer your question, but I do think, like, you know, this is the central drama of the show, right? Is that Akiva's search for love and fulfillment as an artist, right? And you know, he's got dreamy green eyes, and you know, slowly that kind of dawns on everyone that he is not just a screw up, he's actually quite beautiful and talented. But here we are. So.
And on that note, I would urge anyone who hasn't yet watched Shtisel that if nothing else draws you in, then certainly the dreamy green eyes should do. And thank you, Dr. Rubel, so much for your presentation. It was very interesting. We really appreciate it and enjoyed it. And thank you everyone for being here. And just a little plug, we have some more adult education activity coming up. Same time, same place, not exactly same channel. It will be Zoom next Wednesday at 7. That Cantor Braun starts her 4-week introduction to Torah trope class. So for anyone who's ever considered chanting Torah but didn't even know how to go about, you know, how to start, the class only presumes that you can read Hebrew, but it doesn't presume that you're musical in any way, shape, or form. She would love to teach us all about that. So feel free. We ask that people pre-register, please, so we can anticipate the size of the group. And that registration is available on the homepage of the website. And with that, I think, Marcia, I see a mouth open.
No, I was just going to thank everybody and say my idea was to use this someday as a platform for conversational Hebrew. And perhaps we'll be looking at that with the adult ed programs too.
So everybody needs to watch the show.
Yep. And
Right.
we do have a follow-up, a little program about that touches on conversational Hebrew. That'll be coming out in December. So keep your eyes open on snippets for that. And
Wrong one.
good night, enjoy, and happy TV watching.
Okay.
And thank you, Nora.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Nora.
Good night.
Right.
Night.
Right.
Thank you.
Nice. So we should do a comparison of Shtisel and Mrs. Maisel.